So welcome everyone from all the many places from which you come together for this conversation with Susan Shaw and Grace Jensen Kim. We're excited to have both of them. I'm excited to have both of them. I would like to just do some introductions, let you get to know who our speakers are today, and then we'll jump into questions. So Susan M. Shaw is Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Oregon State University. She's been on faculty since 1996, which is, I did the math, Susan, you've been there a long time.
I have.
So that's beautiful. But Susan teaches courses in global feminist theologies in the US, gender, race, and pop culture, feminism in the Bible. And then she also teaches some fun, amazing classes. Like last fall, she spent in London teaching a class on British murder mysteries and crime drama. I mean, is that not the best class that anybody could enroll in? So much fun. And to do it in London, that would be great. Susan is also an ordained Baptist minister. Some of you may know her. She's a frequent contributor to Baptist News Global with lots of different articles. I tried to count up all the books that Susan has written over the years. It was just too much work, so I just gave up. But she is a prolific writer of books. She's a graduate of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and she's a graduate of Berry College in Rome, Georgia. And that connection, the Georgia connection, is, I think, maybe one of the reasons that we got to know each other. Susan was working on a book called God Speaks to Us Too, Southern Baptist Women in Church and Society. And she published it in 2008. And I think that's the first time she ever reached out to me in email. We became email friends and have had time to spend together over the years. But her research interest and writing match up so much with the things I'm interested in. So that scholarship and friendship has been important to me. So welcome to you, Susan, all the way from Oregon.
Thanks, Pam.
I'm glad to see you. And then Grace Jensen Kim is Professor of Theology at Erland School of Religion in Richmond, Indiana. Grace, luckily, has the published number of books. She has 22 books, including Invisible, Theology and Experience of Asian American Women, which is one of her more recent books that connected with what we do here at Central with our students, 70% of whom are Asian. So that was a book that was important for our community. She hosts a podcast that features conversations on Christianity, religion, and culture. She's lectured all over the world. She writes for many faith-based blogs, magazines, and journals, as well as being one who is interviewed by secular news outlets. She's ordained to Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA. And Grace was born in South Korea, educated in Canada, and now lives in the United States. And our Central community knows Grace because in 2022, she was our commencement speaker. We were blessed to have her here on campus and spend time with her. And also very blessed by her commencement address, which was both in English and Korean at times, which made a very hospitable, belonging place for our Korean graduates and their families. So I'm so excited for the two of you to join us today.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation. It's so great to be back, and I recognize some faces. So wonderful.
Well, thank you, Grace. Susan and Grace have written multiple times together. Their newest book is Surviving God, A New Vision of God Through the Eyes of Sexual Abuse Survivors. And it is hot off the press, not available yet to the public, but I saw that both of them received their copies in the last week. And so it will be released officially on March 26th. So if you have not ordered your copy, you can do that and you'll be receiving it within the next couple months. The book is the topic of our conversation today, but I have a few questions that I'd like to start with about your friendship and your writing partnership. So tell us how you met and when you began talking about writing together.
Well, I'll start off because it happened because I was teaching Grace's book on Sophia in my feminist theologies class. And my colleague, Robert Thompson, in ethnic studies said, oh, I've met Grace Kim, do you want me to see if we could get her to come speak here? And I thought, oh, that'd be brilliant because I love for students to have opportunities to interact with authors. And so Robert got in touch with Grace. We were able to bring her out, and she spoke on campus and met with my class. And we really just hit it off. You know, we're kind of kindred spirits. Then we spent years talking about let's write together, let's write together. But then Grace, who churns out books like nobody I've ever seen, would have another project, or then I would have something. And so it took a while till finally we both had a space at the same time. And that's when we started having conversations about, well, what should we write about? And what we came up with was the book that the idea that became the book Intersectional Theology. And that just went so well, we thought, well, let's do something else. And so through the years, we've presented together, written together, spoken together. And Grace, you can take it from there, but that's kind of how we initially connected.
I think that's a good beginning. So that's how it started. But I must correct that I actually never met your colleague, but he listened to me on the radio so many times that he felt like he met me.
Oh, that's funny. Oh my gosh, that's
So
hilarious.
yeah, and then that's how I got invited to speak out there at Oregon State University. And I remember the first meeting, we were just saying, "Oh, let's just write something together." I don't know how that got into the conversation, but it took years before we actually decided, "Oh, let's do a book." And then intersectional theology came, and then when we were done, we said, "Oh, let's do another one," which is this one. And while we were finishing off this one, we decided to do our third one. So we're going to do another one together, which is very unusual because it's really hard to write with other people. I've written books with maybe 3 others and then Susan, but it's always a joy to write with Susan because she's so smart. She can just, she's so insightful. So it's really a big joy. So I'm really happy with this book. It wasn't an easy book to write, but the journey it took us on, it was a good journey, and we'll continue the journey as we share it here and in other places. So we're grateful to be here with
And
you
we've
all.
really developed a friendship too. I mean, we've been in each other's homes. We know each other's partners. I know Grace's kids, and so it's grown to be more than that. And so that was what was so fun when she, went out to Central Seminary, and I'm like, oh yes, I have a connection there as
Yeah.
well. Uh,
Yeah.
and yeah, so it's been a very wonderful partnership. And our next book is when Rutledge got in touch. They have a series called The Basics where they introduce different academic disciplines. And so we're doing one that's called Feminist Theology, The Basics. And that'll be out, I think, in 25, early 26.
Oh my.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by, so Susan, you're in Oregon and Grace is in Indiana. How do you write a book together? I mean, what does that even look like?
Actually, my school's in Indiana, but I actually live in the East Coast. So I'm in Pennsylvania, really close to New York. It is interesting how you can write. Yeah. And I must add, when I was a PhD student, my supervisor, he said, he just told me one day, oh, he co-wrote a book with his wife, who is a minister. And I had this romantic feeling. I said, oh my gosh, that's so beautiful to co-write with your wife. I said, wow, that is so amazing. I said, I want to do that when I finish. And he said to me, because I remember it clearly, this was over 30 years ago, he said, Grace, we're just still lucky to be married to one another because it's not easy. I know friends who have problems over punctuation marks and various sentences, and then they'll be stuck for months or years at it, and they can't get over it because they're going to be both stern about their stance on a punctuation mark. But Susan and I, it's been very easy. We're in different time zones, but I'll write something and send it to her, and she'll fix it all up for me.
And vice versa.
So do y'all ever get together and like do the
Yeah,
brainstorming?
we've tried to get together at least at the beginning. So I've been able to go to Grace's twice, and we go over to the Wegmans supermarket and get some food and go sit upstairs and
Yeah.
plot our strategies. And then we have a lot of back and forth, so one of us will write a piece and send it to the other, and then the other will edit that and make it better and send it back. And I think part of it is neither one of us has a lot of ego invested in um, having things appear just like we wrote them. So we're open to each other's editing and suggestions. And part of the strength is because of our diverse identities and experiences. And so Grace teaches me so many wonderful things that come from her Korean background. And she'll tell me this like Korean word and explain it, and I'll be like, oh my God, that's what I've been searching for. That's the answer. And I can bring in things around differences of sexuality, and we have these different but overlapping disciplines. And so our work, I think, is richer because we write together and bring these different, and there's a point even in this book where we have a theological disagreement about the afterlife. And so we write about it that way. It's like, well, here's what I think, here's what Grace thinks, and we just let those stand side by side. And I think that's just been also a wonderful way to model theological disagreement.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
that's a very important point, Susan, because co-authors, they don't need to agree. I think many do, and then for us, even though we disagree, we can still write about it and show where we disagree. And I think that's a model for intersectional theology. It's not clear, it's not clean cut, it's messy at times, and there can be a both and aspect. And we are just these finite human beings. We will never know the fullness of the mystery of God, whom we try to write about and talk about. So we will never know that. So I think a lot of humility coming from both of us in writing about this and this particular subject too.
Well, Surviving God, I just wanted to say a few words about this book. I got an early copy and was asked to write an endorsement. So this is what I wrote, and then I have another person's endorsement I'd like to read. So, Surviving God, a new vision of God through the eyes of sexual abuse survivors, is a much needed message of assurance and comfort for survivors of sexual abuse and those who support them. As survivors themselves, Grace and Susan make the hard journey of deconstructing their learned theology and reimagining God as one who suffers with us, liberates us for the work of justice, and calls us to create beloved communities that are safe, welcoming, liberatory, and transformative. In these days of never-ending sexual abuse news stories, both in and outside the church, Surviving God is an important work for faith leaders and survivors. But there was another blurb. It was written by Jennifer Garcia Bashaw, who is at Campbell University in Booze Creek, North Carolina, and is a friend of mine as well. She wrote this: if I were in charge, I would make this required reading for the leaders of every church that has swept abuse under the rug, allowed enabling structures to, I guess I typed this, I must have missed a word, enabling structures to the vulnerable or failed to believe and support victims in their congregations. Surviving God is a gift to survivors of all kinds and a call to repentance and action to everyone else. So, why this book? Why did you decide to write about this really emotionally, spiritually charged topic?
Mhm. Well, we were, in the midst of Me Too and Church Too, and then the pandemic, and more things were coming out because, we'd had the Catholic Church scandal, and then we had, Southern Baptist, and, that Houston Chronicle report that first highlighted the 700. And I've also known Krista Brown and Dee Miller forever, who wrote early on about the problems of abuse among Southern Baptists. And so it felt like a really timely topic. And then Grace and I are both survivors as well, and so wanted to bring this sort of new method of intersectional theology to bear on this, because there were so many people who seemed to be suffering and struggling and trying to figure out what to do with sex abuse.
Yeah, I think that's exactly how it began. And, you know, when we're thinking about the different topics to cover, this came up. And I think, I don't know how Susan was, but it's still always scary talking about it and wondering how everyone is going to react. Because until this book, I really never publicly talked about this. So, I said to Susan, I interviewed her for my own podcast, Madang, last week. It won't be out for a few more weeks. But I said, this is an ongoing journey. We don't know how people are going to respond, how the church is going to react. But this is just a little piece from two women and other voices that we included, which we hope will bring lots of healing for individuals and communities, because we know, like, especially in the Korean American or many Asian communities, we don't talk about this. It's almost a taboo to talk about it. So I don't know how people are going to respond. It's going to come out next month. So it's always a scary journey, but to do it along with someone else like Susan, it's been helpful. And we're hoping that it will really bring healing, because when the Me Too happened, we know that the churches, many suffered in silence, and some people feel they can't talk about it or name the perpetrator. Um, this is not an easy topic, and it wasn't an easy book to write, but I'm glad with what we have done together.
Mhm. And throughout so much of this book, you talk about the image of God, which made me think about when I have led spiritual formation classes or led retreats. Sometimes I start off with the question of, what was your image of God when you were 4, 5, 6 years old? How did you think about God when you were very young? And I always tell the story about when I was like 4 or 5. I imagined God as the Shriners who rode in those little cars in the parades, and they had the little hats on, fezzes on, and they would toss candy, and that was really the way I thought about God, of this God who had a cute little car, drove around, and tossed candy to us. I think I've developed a more mature image of God over the years, but that whole idea of image of God. So, Susan, how did you think about God when you were really, really young?
Well, I grew up in, a hellfire and damnation fundamentalist Southern Baptist church in Rome, Georgia. So, um, and we did talk about this in the book, how, I mean, on the one hand, I was taught that, God is love and God loves everybody, but boy, God could zap you at any given minute and would send you to hell in a heartbeat. To the point where when I was 6, there was a traveling evangelist who came through town preaching a revival, and I started having all these nightmares about going to hell. I mean, it's 6. And so the last night of the revival, the choir was singing Just As I Am during the altar call, and I'm gripping the back of the pew, but I know I've got to go up front and accept Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior so I don't die and go to hell. And I look back now and I see that as also a form of abuse, as well, to make a 6-year-old have nightmares about going to hell. Uh, so again, as we say in the book, that's a perfect setup for abuse. I mean, what a setup that the person who loves you most is also the person who can send you to hell. No, I mean, we from the beginning, I felt like looking back, I was conditioned to accept that somebody who is supposed to love you unconditionally can also do horrible things to you, and you're at the mercy of their power. So my image wasn't so great in retrospect. At the time I didn't know anything better, so it was, of course, I loved God, but accepted, as I did my abuse at the time, but I accepted that God could also do horrible things to me.
Hmm. Boy,
Pam,
that's
I love your
nice.
question. I think it's important. And before I answer it, I want to say, I really love Central Seminary because it's so diverse. And I experienced it when I was there a couple of years ago. and even the people that are part of this Lunch and Learn, we have such diversity. You have so many Asian students, foreign students, immigrant students, which I'm just so grateful for that it's such a welcoming place for non-white students to come and study. I say that because, I was born in Korea, and when white missionaries came to Asia, like Myanmar and Korea, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, and India, and the Philippines, they really brought a white male god. You'll hear it from many of us in Asia. That's the God that was exposed to us. And for those of us who immigrated to North America, that's the God that was reinforced either in our immigrant churches or in the white churches that we ended up going to. So that was the image that was always with me as a child and into my early adult life, that God cannot be other than a white male God. And, for me as a theologian, I've realized how impactful our own image of who God is. So yours, when you were a child, Pam, as someone giving candy, or with Susan, being scared, and I was scared too, because even though Susan and I are different denominations, grew up in different places, my my Christianity or the church experience is very similar to Susan's
Mm.
experience. So it wasn't this, oh, loving white male God. It was this brimstone and fire white male God. I was scared all the time too. And as a young adult, studying in seminary, doing my PhD, and trying to figure out, is this actually who God is? So I think our image of God really impacts our whole kind of worldview, our theological understanding. It impacts how we act and live every day. So I'm glad you asked that question, because that's what we also explore in the book as survivors and as people who have been victimized by the church.
Like you talk about in the book some of the metaphors that we use for God and the way that they impact faith communities, like Father, Master, Lord, and King. Would you talk a little bit about that, of the metaphors that we as people of faith have used and how that shapes how we think about God?
Mhm. Go ahead, Grace, you can take this one.
Well, those are the metaphors that I grew up with. We sang about it. We liturgy, prayers. I prayed in Korean a lot as a child and as a youth, and the favorite kind of word that we used was, I don't know if there's any Koreans here listening. It was 하나님 아버지, which is translated as Heavenly Father. So it was pray. That was a very common way to pray to God. It was always Heavenly Father. It was always this masculine Lord, um, King. And I think, why are we using it? We have to ask that type of question. Why are we using this? And because there are other images in the Bible. It's not just the masculine, it's not just the king and lord. These are like feudal terms that was very common in white European settings. So that's why it made sense. It also perpetuates the status quo. It says it's okay because we live in this patriarchal society. So, of course, God has to be some masculine, kingly figure, and if you're going to other parts of the world and colonizing various parts of Africa, South America, and Asia, this kingly kind of empire building God really reinforces what you are doing. So, there are consequences to the words that we use, whether it's bad consequences or, by default good. And we really need to be aware of that, because um, when we're talking about sexual abuse survivors or those who have been abused sexually, and then thinking in larger terms like physical abuse and mental and verbal abuse, many people in the church will legitimize their abuse upon the victim and those who are weaker than them, as it's okay because God is on my side. God is this masculine, white male, dominant figure, and whatever I'm doing is okay.
Mhm. Mhm.
Did you want to say anything, Susan?
I think that covered it pretty
Yeah.
well.
Pretty much covers it. One of the terms you use is kaleidoscopic imagery, and I want you to tell us what you mean by that and how we should understand that.
Mhm. It's funny that that seems to be, maybe that's going to be our contribution, Grace, because that is the term people bring up about intersectional theology, and now about this book as well. And so I'm excited we've contributed something. But it's the idea that we can't hold in mind one image of God as if that is a reality, but that rather we have to hold in mind at the same time multiple images of God, including competing images and images that are at odds. Grace earlier mentioned both and, which comes from um, feminist writers on intersectionality, and it's this idea that we have to be more complex in our thinking. So rather than turning everything into this sort of binary either or, we should approach things as both and. And so we can think of God in both these ways and these ways and not have to choose between them. In intersectionality, though, the thing that lets us decide if images are valuable and useful is justice. Because otherwise, people could just say, well, every image is equally valuable then. So it's not uh, sort of an accepting of images without some evaluation of them. But in intersectionality, how we determine whether an image is valuable is, does it lead us toward justice? Does it point us toward justice? Or does it point us away from justice? And those are the images that we should critique and challenge and reject.
Yeah. And I can't remember how we came up with that kaleidoscopic image, but some people here are very young, so they may not know. When I was growing up, we had this long test tube kind of long thing. And I don't know, I think we called it kaleidoscope. And you would look through it and you would turn it, and they were like it was like a stained glass window that you're looking at, but as you're turning it, it would change shapes and lights and different colors. It was a beautiful thing. And I think maybe that's how we came up with it, because it was actually in our other previous book, right? Yeah, and then I forget everything that I write after it's done. But I thought that was a good image because the church has been patriarchal, our society is patriarchal, where Christianity emerged is patriarchal. So of course they're going to only pick the masculine images and use Father, Abba, Lord images. But if you dig deeper, so Susan mentioned that she was using my earlier book. It was my first book called The Grace of Sophia. And that one, if you look at scripture, that you do have these feminine images of who God is. You have the wisdom figure, which was always identified as a lady wisdom or feminine. And you have these other images of a hen or an eagle taking care of their children. El Shaddai means God of breasts. And we traditionally associate breasts with women and fertility. So there are all these other images that we don't focus on or emphasize that is embedded in our biblical traditions. So this kaleidoscopic understanding really says, let's look beyond what we've been exposed to and look at the beautiful images. And I think we get more and more beautiful images as we're working on other, Susan mentioned the social justice issues. I think now with climate change issue, gender justice, racial justice, we want to explore different images, many that are already embedded in our scripture, and try to retrieve them and see how that can really help us, because the patriarchal, limited patriarchal exclusive images have not been helpful for many women and for abused victims.
And I think the other thing with the kaleidoscope is that it's always changing. And so
Yeah.
we have to make sure that our images of God are always changing. And then that can depend on what's going on in our lives, what's going on in the world. For me, it's often reading theologians from other places who have these amazing images. And we try to bring a lot of that into the book because, again, Grace and I can only write from our own social locations. And so we wanted to hear the voices of people from other parts of the world and other identities. And so it just kind of it keeps us open and off balance. Sally McFague said that the point of our images of God is that they should be shocking, because they should be teaching us something new, helping us think about things in new ways. And I think the kaleidoscope, challenges us to continue to be open to that and to be seeking it, as a matter of fact, and looking for those new images.
Yeah. My image of God moved, of course, past my Shriner man in a car. Um, and most recently in 2022, when my mother died, the image of God I held really closely was this mother hen image in the gospel, one of the gospels that was comforting to me. But it is also shocking in the sense of not just the feminine image, but a hen from as God. So I think that's beautiful. The kaleidoscope. I'm old enough to certainly remember and have had
Okay.
many kaleidoscopes, Grace. So it's a good way to help us think about this.
Yeah.
And so you talked some, Susan, about this both and thinking.
Mhm.
Could you say some more about that, of how we began to understand, especially those who have experienced sexual abuse, how they can use this kind of thinking and imagery to help them in their re- learning to survive and thrive following abuse?
Well, I think it's things like we can be both faithful believers and we can be angry agnostics. And that it's fine to be all those things. It's fine to feel what you're feeling in all of this. We can both be doing what we're supposed to do and not have to rush to forgiveness for a perpetrator, that we can do that in our own time. And so again, it's not forcing survivors in particular to have to make choices of either I do these things the church is telling me to do, or I am not a good Christian person. But it makes room for it to, again, be more complicated, more complex. It does away with the necessity for easy answers, and in fact says easy answers really aren't a good answer anyway.
Yeah. And to add to that, I think much of my task in the last 10 years, I feel like, is to dismantle this dualistic outlook and this dualism that we find within Christianity. It just pops up so much in my work, and I feel it's been kind of destructive in the sense that, Christianity emerged in this Greco-Roman world where, Greek philosophy, this dualism was so embedded in Christianity. So dualism is viewing the world as, separated into categories. So man and woman, heaven and earth, good and evil, spirit and body. So this complete split in how we view the world and how we view Christianity and who God is. But if you have this both and, it's a very helpful way to see that, Jesus was both God and human. I think that would be a classic example. Now we're dealing issues with gender identity, trans, etc., where, we can't think because we're just so fixated in everything being split that you cannot have either or both and. And so in our intersectional thinking and here as abuse survivors, we feel, okay, you got to be this or you're not this. We feel, and churches keep teaching us that all the time. And I think that's why it takes so long for survivors to kind of overcome maybe guilt or, there's a million emotions and things that affect you in so many ways that it's so hard to overcome it because it's going to be either or,
Mhm.
but I think this both and thinking really helps us and releases us into becoming healed and embraced by the love of God. I'm so thankful that Pam, you shared the image of the mother hen when you lost your mother. This loving image that sometimes gets lost in this Lord and kingly image, because that feels we're so out of touch with that kind of, and we think it's like so power driven. But in this mother hen image, we see this kind of non-powerful creature still being able to protect and to love her own chicks. I think that's such a beautiful image. And so this both and is, I think, really important for us Christians struggling with so many issues these days.
I think a practical way it's important for the church is in thinking about how the church deals with perpetrators, because so much of the church's response is, particularly among evangelicals, is the perpetrator just has to pray to God and be forgiven. And then once that relationship with God is right, nothing else matters, it's all done. And why can't that person who was abused get over it? They need to forgive them because God has forgiven them. But I think we have to say, yes, you do have to be right with God. And the only way you get there is getting right with other human beings. And that gets led by the survivor, not the perpetrator. And so I think evangelical, we don't have a good theology of penance and atonement. I mean, we've made it so easy, what Bonhoeffer calls cheap grace, that we can say the magic formula to God and it's all taken care of. And I think we need to really think about, what do we demand of perpetrators? We give the example in the book of Andy Savage, who abused one of the youth under his care. And so he confessed to the church. Church stood up and gave him a standing ovation. What I want to ask him is, are you paying for her therapy? Because that's what you need to be doing, among other things. And so I think the church needs to think about, what will we ask of perpetrators? And one of the things we cannot ask of victims is that they become responsible for the spiritual life of the perpetrator.
Yeah.
If she never wants to see him again, he needs to be asked to leave the church. And we know that women can be abusers, but let's face it, the vast majority of abusers are men, and we need to keep that gendered aspect in mind, while not, again, and not negate that this happens, that women can do this to others as well. So again, we want to keep that complicated, and at the same time recognize that it is a gendered phenomenon in very particular sorts of ways. So I think that's something the church needs to think about, is how do we do all this? Because at least what I'm seeing, particularly in the Southern Baptist, I'm UCC now. Let me just clarify that. I'm in the United Church of Christ. So I went as far left as I could go without, in fact, some people say UCC stands for, Unitarians Considering Christianity. So this was my answer to the Southern Baptist Convention. But I keep an eye on them from the safety of a public university in Oregon. And I mean, they are just mucking this response up at every possible turn. They are doing the wrong thing, which does not surprise me. And I've written a lot about this as well. But I think for those of you who do care about survivors, thinking about your church's response is really important, so that it's both and that the survivor is on center for the responses, not the perpetrator, because Southern Baptists keep putting the perpetrator right back on center.
Well, in my work at Baptist Women in Ministry I did a lot around clergy sexual abuse.
Mm.
And so many of the stories I heard were of victims being asked to take responsibility and to stand before the church and forgive without any, anything other than just that theology of repentance and penance in Baptist life often is neglected, and I think you're very true on that. So how do you help congregations move toward a better theology, and how do you help them know how to best serve victims and survivors?
We're academics, so we write books. That's how we do it.
And they're good books too. They're good books.
Well, I can say, I bring in the Korean terms into many of my writings. And I know, Pam, you have children Korean, born in Korea. And I don't know if you've taken them to Korean language school, but my parents forced me to go to Korean language school. So you've taken them to Korean language?
For a couple of years before they rebelled about going to school 6 days a week and said, no, no more.
I
So
know.
2
And then
years.
I said, I'll never take my kids kicking and screaming to Korean school. And I took them literally kicking and screaming. They were, I finally got them in the car. And then when we got to the church for the language school, they would hold on to the car door and I had to yank them out of the car.
Yeah.
It was
Very good.
horrible. I said, I'll never do it. But, my parents did it to me. And then I thought I'll never do it, but I felt it's so important to learn the language. So I did it anyway. But looking back, I'm so glad I learned the Korean language and the culture. You learn more than that. You learn the history and everything else, and you learn about the food. Because now, all these years later, 40 something years later, it's been helpful in my theological writing. So one of the words is Han, H-A-N. I've written it up in several other books, and we included it here. So Susan did mention, we're so quick with this vertical relationship, in the church, okay, just repent and then you'll be forgiven. Everything is good. And you can go back and be a great minister or a great elder or a youth pastor. We do that so quickly, and we forget the horizontal relationship. So the word Han means unjust suffering. And many theologians, the Korean American and other theologians, are now using that to talk about the other side of sin. So the church has emphasized so much about our sin against God that we don't emphasize enough about our sin against each other, our other brothers and sisters. And this will be, a whole slew of sins that we've committed. But for today, we'll just think about the sexual abuse sins. So because we forget about the other side of sin, we forget that we need to do something. It's not just, oh, God, forgive me. You have to seek forgiveness. You have to do something against your brothers and sisters that you have sinned against or that you have made victims, sexual abuse victims. So it gets really complicated. It's a lot of work. We're hoping that this book will be helpful in so many ways. This is just an hour session, and I think we're going to go to Q&A from the participants. But we're really hoping that the churches will take this very seriously. I think churches in general have not. They just say, oh, it's really nothing. But we know the amount of damage it does to victims. Some people never survive. Some people, it takes so long, so much therapy, so much money spent and time. And we want the church as a whole to take this really seriously and consider themselves. Susan and I don't have all the answers, but we do draw, we share so much in there that they will take these issues seriously. And each community needs to figure out how they're going to work in helping the victim, and what are they going to do with the perpetrator. It's very complicated. It's not one easy way. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this problem worldwide. But it is a very complicated issue. It's a delicate issue, and the church really needs to struggle and grapple with it.
And I think one of the things that intersectionality can help us with is to recognize that it's not just an issue between individuals, that it's an institutional and structural issue, that is both caused by patriarchy and it serves to maintain patriarchy. And when I say patriarchy, I mean, white, heterosexist, ableist, cisgender, the whole bit. And so the church, it's not simply how do we get, people to behave better toward other people, but the church has to ask, how do we enable this structurally? That can be things like excluding women from leadership. That can be things like theologies that teach submission. That can be things like, who gets to make what kinds of decisions, how pastors handle counseling when people show up in their office in abusive situations. I mean, when I was writing the book on Southern Baptist women, one of my respondents, who's a very well-known conservative leader, when I asked what she did about abused women, she said, I tell them to go back. And if she's living right and praying, God will change him. And I said, well, what if not? And she goes, well, it's okay, because even if he kills her, she's saved, so she's going to heaven, and that's all right. That's a structural problem. That wasn't just one bad person saying bad things. That is a problem of a whole theological system that has been structured to maintain, male power. And so I think it has to be both and. We have to deal with the individuals involved, but we have to make change at the structural level.
Yeah. Oh. Thank you, Susan and Grace. We have about 10 minutes left. If anyone would like to ask a question, you could just unmute yourself and speak up. We'll take a few minutes if anyone has one. Okay. Seeing no questions, then I have more questions. You write about survivors and their resurrection stories. I'd like for you to talk some about that. Just you use that in your book, so I thought that's a really fascinating way to look at this.
Susan, you can go ahead.
Well, we talk about Jesus as a survivor. And that chapter was really hard. It's really funny. As much as I think about this stuff, this shows how deeply ingrained those stained glass Sunday school stories are, because I know what happens when people live under empire and people go to prison and people are in the hands of men with power over them. And yet I never applied that to Jesus. And so when I was reading some stuff about the very strong likelihood that Jesus was sexually assaulted and probably raped when he was in the hands of the Romans, it was a gut punch to me. It was just a gut punch, because I had not ever let myself go there. But then we think about, and one of the questions, of course, we ask throughout the book is what kind of God would let, much less cause, this kind of stuff. And so what we determine is, of course, God doesn't. But what we say then is, in the story of Jesus, is that Jesus experienced all of that not because Jesus had to do that to pay back God for something. God did not need Jesus to suffer. I mean, what kind of loving God would need that? But rather, Jesus went through all of that because Jesus wouldn't back down for standing up for the oppressed. And Jesus therefore became a threat to the empire, because the empire was the only one who had the power to put people to death. And so because Jesus was a threat to him, I mean, remember, there were zealots in Jesus' group of disciples. Zealots were people specifically working to overthrow the Roman Empire. So zealots heard something in Jesus's message. And so Jesus ended up going through all of this and suffering because Jesus stood up for what was right and stood for justice and for love. The resurrection then becomes, in the story, the way that we see that God affirms Jesus's choices. So that Jesus made these choices. Jesus had no idea, what was going to happen, but Jesus did the right thing. And the right thing was justice, and the right thing was love. And God affirmed that then in the narrative through this device of the resurrection. And so that, for me, becomes then a really helpful image to think about what can happen for survivors, because abuse for many of us is a kind of death. that many of us when we're young, I mean, we don't even suffer it because of anything we did or anybody we crossed or whatever. It's just we're vulnerable. And so we can experience our own kinds of resurrection where we take back our power, where we're able to heal from what's happened. And even more than that, we are able then to turn around and work for justice ourselves, particularly on behalf of other survivors. And Carrie Newcomer, who's a singer-songwriter, has this wonderful song. One of the lines in it, she says, "Keep practicing resurrection." And I think that's what grace and a part of the encouragement we want to offer is healing's not a one and done. I mean, you don't, just poof, magically get healed. But and it's not something you just sit around and wait to happen magically either. It is something you work for, and it is part discipline and it is part gift. And it is something that you practice so that every day you were looking for that affirmation and that resurrection.
Well, we do have a comment in the chat from Ashley Robinson, who can't turn on her camera or speak wherever she is. So I'll just read what she said. "I cannot wait for this book to be out. I have needed this resource in the past month as I'm leading a church in discernment process for writing a policy about registering child sex offenders
Mhm.
in our worship space. It's a messy situation, and I am inclined to create beloved space for survivors since they are so often silenced and forgotten. I
Mhm.
welcome any resources or policies that are already written as the leadership works toward a more comprehensive, safe sanctuary policy." So
Mhm.
I think your book is important for churches in this way, Susan, that it helps them rethink um, how to love and nurture survivors and to prioritize the needs of survivors. So thank you, Ashley, for that. Did y'all have any response?
I think Tim also wrote a
Yeah.
question.
Yes.
Can you discuss how this relates to or applies to the inclusion of LGBTQIAs in the church?
Yes.
Yeah, maybe Susan, you want to address that? Because
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's present throughout. Because I'm queer myself, and so we definitely pay attention to that and recognize that queer bashing itself is a form of gender-based violence, and it is a form of sexual violence. And so we take that on. And again, I think churches that exclude queer folk and churches who make queer folk out to be sinners are enabling abuse against LGBTQ people, particularly when you think about, the sexual assault, particularly of gay men, but also lesbians. I mean, around the world, you still see places where, lesbians are raped as a way supposedly to make them heterosexual again. And we see places in the world that are creating draconian laws against LGBTQ people. And so I think the church enables that. And you see, I mean, what's going on in the Worldwide Anglican Fellowship right now is, you're about to have a split, and the Archbishop of Canterbury is doing his darndest to hold it together. And I don't know if that's a good idea, either, because whose side of justice is he coming down on? And so I think that we have got to also make that central in this and recognize that sexuality, as well as gender, race, class, is a key issue in the ways that we think about sexual abuse. And we have to fight the myth too that abuse makes you a lesbian or a gay man or whatever. That's
and
just
really emphasizing the intersectionality of these social justice issues, the gender identity and intersecting with racial
Mhm.
and our sexuality, they all intersect. And, you know, s- for Asian immigrants who came 100, 200 years ago, a lot of the men were feminized.
Mhm.
That was just what white dominant culture did. So, they were relegated to roles of, washing clothes, washing dishes, because those were feminine jobs. So I think recognizing the intersectionality of these social justice issues are so important when we're dealing with the sexual abuse. And then going back to Chris Ashley Robinson's kind of comment, I don't know if we've included any resources or policies, but I think every church has to struggle. And then there are also laws that we need to be aware of. If anyone volunteers, I know within the PCUSA, everybody does the fingerprinting to make sure that they are not a sexual offender or they're not in the database. So there's a lot of things that churches can do to protect young children and youth, to make sure that the youth pastor or some leader isn't abusing the children. So I think looking into that, but when churches kind of push it under the rug, that is a huge problem because there are going to be huge consequences to that. So churches must struggle with it. And so we don't have that many practical, but theologically, I think, dealing with our theology really affects our own practices and our own ways of behavior. So we really want to really dig into the theological problem. And from there, we're hoping that churches and communities and individuals can kind of work out of all these abusive situations and communities.
Yeah, and what I want to connect here, and this connects, Michelle, to your comment there. So one of the ways Southern Baptists are mucking this up is they are going to the most narrow definition. They're going to legal definitions, and they're saying, well, it has to be somebody, who's been credibly accused, blah, blah, blah. Well, we know the statistics about first of all, how few survivors ever speak up. And then of that, I mean, if we're going through the law, we're going to end up with very, very few people who will ever go on Southern Baptist database because this is so difficult. But Michelle gives us, I think, a great way to think about this here, because you're right, Michelle. I think the language of perpetrator moves us into thinking about these sort of legal ways and lets people off the hook. And what Michelle says, if you haven't had a chance to read her comment, is this idea of people who do harm. And I think when we think in that way, then we move away from this notion of, well, was it credible? Were there witnesses? Were there, whatever Southern Baptists are trying to do in other denominations. So, did you just send that to me? Oh, okay. Well, that's
But now we can all see it, Susan. So thank you, Michelle.
And so I think that's a great way to think about it, is that people who've done harm, and how do we, and in this case, particularly people who've done sexual harm, how do we address that within the church so that we do create these safe spaces? And I think for people who've been abused in the churches, like Michelle mentioned, the physical space, is that it can be traumatizing simply to walk in the doors of a church because harm has been done there, or when Christian people have done you harm outside the church even. I mean, I kind of find that, true just because of so much harm in other ways that has been done. And so I think that we can even broaden our thinking to imagine, what do we do with people who do harm, and how do we create safe spaces? And again, I think that while the church is responsible for the perpetrator, priority goes to, or the one who's done harm, priority needs to go to the person who's been harmed. And the church has to deal with everybody. The church doesn't have to let everybody be in the same space at the same time. And I think we've got to get better at drawing those lines and recognizing that if we move toward justice, then that helps us be clear about who gets prioritized and how we deal with people. But it hasn't gone that way normally in most churches that I've seen.
No, it has not. Well, we are bumping up on an hour, and I think we could have this conversation for another couple hours, but we want to honor the time that people have made for this conversation. So I want to close by just saying thank you to Grace and Susan for this sharing of your research, your writing, to tell us about your book, to share your experiences and your friendship with us.